Chapter 9, Patterns of Inheritance. So, genetics and heredity. So, heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. If you think about it, you have a family appearance in the sense that you look somewhat like your parents or your grandparents, etc. And that's because of the transmission of our genetic information from one generation to the next. So genetics is the scientific study of heredity. And we will talk a bit about Gregor Mendel, who is considered the father of genetics, and a lot of the important work he did in establishing what we know about genetics and heredity back in the 1860s. So one of the things that Gregor Mendel examined and explored was that parents pass on their offspring discrete genetic information as genes. And genes are responsible for our inherited traits. And we'll discuss that a gene is a bit of genetic information, a bit of our DNA that has the information for things like proteins. And we'll talk more about that as we go through this chapter. So genes also retain their characteristics and their qualities from one generation after another. No matter how that genetic information, those genes are mixed or even masked or hidden sometimes. And again, we'll examine this and hopefully it'll be clear for you guys. So the work that Gregor Mendel did to establish the foundation of genetics was through experimentation with a relatively simple topic: characteristics in garden peas. So just like some of the peas that you guys can go and buy the seeds in the grocery store and plant, a relatively humble plant, but it helped Gregor Mendel establish the foundations of genetics. So one of the reasons that Mendel studied and worked with the garden pea was that it was easy to grow. He could control the breeding of the plant, and it came in a number of readily indistinguishable varieties. We'll talk more about what I mean about a variety. So a character or a characteristic is a heritable feature that varies among individuals. So for example, with the pea, we can talk about the color of the flower or the color of the actual pea itself. Now contrast that with a trait. A trait is a variant or a version of a characteristic or of a character. So for example, yellow and green are the traits for the character of color. And each character that Mendel studied in the pea occurred in two distinct traits. So for example, the character of the seed shape came in two traits: round or wrinkled seeds. And we'll talk about that as well. So an advantage to working with a pea plant was that Mendel could strictly control how they reproduced, which plant, in a sense, bred with another plant. If you think about this, if you compare this with animals, people who breed dogs, for example, they're very careful about which male dog breeds with which female dogs, so they're able to control the reproduction so that they get a particular type of dog. So pea flower is a type of flower that has both male and female reproductive parts. So they have a structure called the carpel that produces eggs. So that's the central portion of the flower here, called the carpel. And inside, it produces eggs. So you can think of the carpel as the female part of the plant. And the same flower also has a sperm-producing structure or structures called stamens. So you can think of the stamens as the male reproductive part of the flower. So the stamens produce pollen. You've heard of pollen grains, for example. Within the pollen grain, there are sperm cells. So again, it's a type of flower, the pea flower, and many flowers are like this in nature, where the one flower, the one individual, has both female reproductive parts and male reproductive parts. So, working in the garden, excuse me, Mendel could control which flowers got fertilized, meaning which carpels were fertilized by the particular pollen from another flower. So for example, in the diagram here, he was able to take pollen, which contains sperm, from the male part of a white pea flower and transfer the pollen by hand and pollinate a flower that had a purple color. And transferring the pollen to the female part, the carpel, he was able to control essentially which plant or which flower was the father plant and which plant was the mother plant. And in doing so, by controlling pollination by hand, Mendel was able to control the breeding within these pea plants. In other experiments, he was able to take pollen from a purple flower and pollinate a white flower, and vice versa, for the different characters that he examined, so that he was sure of the parentage of the new plants that were produced. So in basic plant biology, once a female carpel is pollinated by the pollen, within the carpel, the eggs get fertilized by the sperm from the pollen, and once the eggs are fertilized, they develop seeds. Seeds that you can plant and get the next generation of the organism, right? So, in Mendel's garden, or the garden in the abbey where he was working, he worked with purebred varieties of plants. That means pea plants that only came in two particular traits for each characteristic. And these were referred to as purebred varieties. So for example, the peas that he worked with, the flower color, the characteristic of color always came in only two traits, either purple or white. In terms of the flower position, where the flower was produced on the plant, the flower was either axial or terminal. Axial meaning kind of coming off on the side near the leaves, and terminal meaning only at the end of a stem. So position. The seed color, which is what we'll focus on quite a bit, was either yellow or green. The seed shape was either round seeds or wrinkled. And the pod shape was either smooth inflated or constricted. And then the pod color was either green or yellow. And then the stem length, the plants were either tall or they were short dwarf. So there was only two versions, two traits for each character. So this is quite different from, say, an animal, like for example us, if we considered something like hair color, we don't only have, say, brown hair and black hair. In humans, there's a huge variety of color. There's a gradation. Same thing, say, with height, right? It's not just people are tall or short. There's a whole gradation of height. So in a sense, these pea plants were fairly simple in the sense that these particular characters only came with 2 traits. So by working with this particular organism, the pea plant, Mendel was able to determine the basics of how the genetic information was passed from the parents to the offspring. And we'll examine this ourselves in this chapter. So, a hybrid. So hybrids are the offspring of 2 purebred varieties of plants in this case. So for example, if a purple flower was crossed, that's what the X means, with a white flower, that means, say, a purple male plant was bred with a white flowering female plant. These were the purebred parents, referred to as the P generation, and their offspring is the F1 generation, and they're referred to as hybrids. If the F1 generation plants breed, and that's what the F1 cross F1 or F1 times F1 refers to, then you get an F2 generation, and so forth and so forth. So if you want to compare this to, say, humans, the P generation could be, say, your grandparents. The F1 generation would be then your parents. And then the F2 generation would be you. Okay? Or if you breed, if you have offspring, you can be considered the P generation. Your children would be the F1 generation. And then the grandchildren could be considered the F2 generation. So it just depends on where you start, what the starting point is, and that's considered the P generation or the parental generation. Okay? So, excuse me, the cross fertilization is a genetic cross. So again, if Mendel took pollen with sperm from a purple flowering plant and pollinated a white flowering plant individual, that's referred to as a genetic cross. And again, the parental plants are the P generation, wherever he happened to start. The hybrid offspring is the F1 generation. And if you do an F1 cross, then the offspring of the F1 cross is the F2 generation. And you can continue with this. So Mendel performed many experiments, I mean hundreds and hundreds, tracking the inheritance of things like color, flower position, seed color, seed shape, pod color, pod shape. Okay, and he took very careful notes. So good scientific experiment. And the results led him to formulate several important hypotheses about the rules of inheritance, how the genetic information is passed on from parents to offspring and offspring to their offspring. So, and we'll focus on what's called the monohybrid cross. And he performed a monohybrid cross between purebred parents that differ in only one character, and found that all of the F1 plants in this example had only purple flowers. So the monohybrid cross means he examined only one character that had the 2 traits, for example, of flower color. Right? So mono meaning one variation of character. So when Mendel did a monohybrid cross and the P generation was purple flowers and white flowers,